Imperial doctrine teaches that knowing your enemy grants advantage. The Tactica Imperium catalogs threat profiles, behavioral patterns, optimal kill zones. Guardsmen memorize the gait of a hormagaunt, their ratch of genestealers, the effective range of termagant weapons. But what happens when the enemy arrives wearing a shape your training never anticipated? On Graia 7th, Sergeant Morton Veck of the Cadian 47th encountered a creature his regiment had no designation for. After the evacuation, he described it to his commissar as "wrong in the bones, sir," like looking at an animal assembled by someone who'd only heard animals described. The commissar ordered him to silence, not because the description was inaccurate, because it was too accurate. Because recognizing that the Tyranids could grow forms beyond classification meant accepting that the enemy was not a fixed threat, but an intelligence responding to every defense humanity deployed. The Great Devourer does not send the same army. Twice, every Hive Fleet learns, every invasion refines, and some of the things it creates are designed not to kill efficiently, but to break the minds of those who witness them. Prandium was an agri-world, 12 billion citizens, surplus grain production sufficient to feed 3 neighboring sectors. When Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived, the planet's PDF outnumbered the initial landing organisms 30-1. Colonel Darren Hask reviewed the early contact reports with confidence. Hormagaunts and termagants, standard bioforms. His troops had drilled against simulated Tyranid swarms for 6 years. The first week of fighting matched expectations. Hive organisms advanced in recognizable patterns. Fire lanes held. Casualties remained within projected parameters. Then the sky changed color. Trooper Jens Malavar, one of 17 survivors evacuated before Prandium's fall, reported the shift in his debriefing. The purple haze arrived at dawn on the 8th day. Not clouds, not smoke. A living membrane stretched across the upper atmosphere, pulsing with visible contractions, like a jellyfish swimming through air. Atmospheric analysis detected exotic proteins and suspended spore colonies. But the true function wasn't biochemical. It was psychological preparation. The membrane filtered sunlight into wavelengths that made shadows pool wrong. Distances became difficult to judge. Straight lines seemed to curve at their edges. Veteran troops who'd fought on a dozen worlds reported disorientation severe enough to induce vomiting. The Tyranids had weaponized the sky itself, turning vision into a liability before the next wave arrived. When the new bioforms emerged from the digestion pools, they moved through that altered light like they'd been designed for it. Guardsman Keller shot the first one he saw. 3 last rounds, center mass, textbook grouping. The creature didn't fall. It tilted what might have been a head and drifted closer, moving without visible means of propulsion. Keller fired again. The last beam scattered against a distortion field. His targeting optics couldn't focus through. The Malanthrope resembled no Tyranid classified in Imperial records. Roughly humanoid in silhouette, but stretched vertically to 3 times human height. Its limbs ended in what one survivor called fingers that kept subdividing, like watching a fern grow in reverse. The head was a bulbous mass split by a vertical seam that occasionally opened to reveal not a mouth, but a cavity filled with smaller organisms that chittered and rearranged themselves. But the physical description misses the encounter's nature. Every soldier who survived contact with a Malanthrope reported the same sensation, a presence pressing against their thoughts. Not psychic attack in the way Imperial psychers deliver it. No pain, no commands, just an awareness that something was reading them, measuring them, cataloging their responses with the clinical detachment of a mechanicus biologist dissecting a specimen. Sergeant Vek's company held a choke point 3 kilometers from the main hive. Standard defensive doctrine. Interlocking fields of fire. Pre-sighted artillery coordinates. When the Malanthrope drifted into view, Vek ordered concentrated fire. 60 laser guns opened up simultaneously. The energy beams curved away from the creature's body, bending through angles that made tracking sights useless. The Malanthrope stopped 50 meters from their position. It didn't attack. For 7 minutes, it simply observed, its body slowly rotating to face each defensive emplacement in turn. Vek's men kept firing. Ammunition counters drained. The Malanthrope remained stationary, apparently unhurt, apparently uninterested in defending itself. Then it left, not retreating, just drifting backward until the purple haze swallowed it. 4 hours later, the Tyranid assault on that position demonstrated perfect knowledge of every weapon placement, every ammunition cache, every blind spot in the defensive coverage. The swarm flowed through weaknesses that shouldn't have been visible from ground level. Vek's company suffered 80% casualties in the first 20 minutes. He concluded that the Malanthrope had transmitted everything it observed directly to the Hive Mind, turning reconnaissance into a weapon more effective than claws. Imperial xenobiologists later theorized that Malanthropes serve as mobile synaptic nodes, extensions of the Hive Mind's consciousness into battlefield environments. They don't command lesser organisms through pheromones or behavioral programming. They directly project the Hive Mind's awareness into local space, turning every Tyranid in range into a precisely controlled limb, rather than a semi-autonomous creature. But the soldiers who encountered them remembered something else. The way they moved suggested not observation, but evaluation. As if humanity itself was being assessed for potential use. Tank crews have a saying, if you can kill it with one shell, it wasn't worth seeing. Trooper Dalrin Crost, gunner for a Lehman Russ executioner, violated that principle on Graia 7 when his squadron encountered what Imperial classification would later designate a Haruspex. The creature stood 8 meters tall, 4 legs, each ending in talons that scored meter-deep furrows in ferrocrete. The torso was a barrel of interlocking chitin plates, but the front opened like a blast door to reveal a cavernous feeding apparatus. Nested rings of teeth rotated independently, grinding against each other with a sound that carried over the noise of battle. Crost estimated 70 tons of biomass, all of it focused on the single purpose of consuming. He fired. The plasma round struck the Haruspex in what appeared to be its center mass. The superheated bolt burned through the outer carapace and detonated inside the creature's body cavity. A blast sufficient to vaporize a squad of infantry left a crater in the creature's torso the size of a man. The Haruspex didn't slow. The wound sealed with visible speed, new tissue bubbling up from depths that shouldn't have existed in a body of that volume. It covered the remaining distance to Crost's tank in 4 strides. The feeding maw opened wider, dislocating like a snake's jaw to impossible dimensions. It consumed the tank in 40 seconds. Not destroyed, consumed. The grinding teeth processed armor plating and crew into undifferentiated biomass. The Haruspex's body visibly swelled, incorporating the tank's mass directly into its own structure. When it moved toward the next vehicle, Crost noted, from his position in the escape hatch, that the creature's armor was thicker. It had metabolized his tank's plating and reinforced itself. The Haruspex represents the Tyranid hive solution to armored warfare. Instead of developing weapons to penetrate heavy armor, the Hive Mind grew a creature that treats armor as food. Every tank destroyed makes it stronger. Every defensive fortification it devours adds to its mass. Kill it with infantry weapons, and it regenerates from stored biomass. Kill it with armor-piercing rounds, and you're feeding it the materials it needs to grow. Sergeant Vek's report included an observation that earned him another session with the Commissar. He noted that the Haruspex didn't prioritize targets based on tactical threat. It consumed vehicles based on their composition. Tanks with ceramide armor drew its attention before those with standard plating. Vehicles with high-grade adamantium components were hunted across the battlefield, while lighter threats were ignored. The creature was selecting its diet based on nutritional value, treating the Imperial armor column not as an enemy formation, but as a buffet arranged by material quality. Greyus VII's chemical core prepared for biological warfare. They deployed in full hazmat suits rated for virus bomb exposure. Their mission briefing covered known Tyranid toxins, acid spray, neurotoxic spores, flesh-dissolving enzymes. When the Toxicrene emerged from the digestion pools, their equipment proved insufficient in ways that defied biochemistry. The creature moved on multiple tentacles that left corrosion trails in the ground. Its body was a suspended sack of translucent tissue, interior visible through the membrane. Inside, fluid circulated in patterns that suggested deliberate mixing. Not a stomach, a laboratory. Corporal Hayes watched the Toxicrene spray a defensive bunker with what appeared to be clear mist. The soldiers inside wore standard-issue respirators. The mist shouldn't have penetrated. Hayes heard screaming over the Vox 3 seconds later. When the bunker's emergency venting activated, what emerged wasn't gas. It was particulate matter fine enough to bypass molecular filters. The chemical core has identified 9 distinct compounds in the recovered samples. 3 were novel proteins that broke down human nerve tissue. 2 were acids that remained stable at room temperature, but activated in contact with human sweat. 4 were unidentified organic molecules that the Mechanicus could not synthesize or even fully analyze. But the Toxicrene's most disturbing feature wasn't the lethality of its compounds. It was the way it adjusted them, mid-battle. Sergeant Brand's platoon encountered a Toxicrene near Hive Secundus. They wore chemical protection rated for the toxins identified in earlier encounters. The Toxicrene sprayed them with a compound their suit's sensors flagged as harmless. A simple organic oil, no toxicity markers. The platoon advanced. 30 seconds later, the oil polymerized inside their suit filters, hardening into a resin that blocked all airflow. The platoon suffocated in equipment designed to protect them, killed by a toxin that didn't exist until the Toxicrene synthesized it in response to their specific defenses. The creature had observed their protection and invented a counteragent in under a minute. Imperial analysis of recovered Toxicrene tissue revealed sophisticated biochemical factories capable of producing thousands of compounds. But the synthesis wasn't random. Each Toxicrene appeared to carry a library of molecular templates that it could combine, modify, deploy based on observed threats. The Hive Mind had created a creature that fought by chemistry rather than strength, and it gave that creature the ability to solve defensive problems through molecular innovation. Guardsmen testimonies from Greyus VII describe watching Toxicrenes experiment on human positions. The creatures would spray one compound, observe the results, then spray a modification 30 seconds later. Bunkers that resisted the first attack often fell to the 4th or 5th variation. as the Toxicrene refined its formula based on real-time feedback. The survivors reported a specific horror uttered through watching. Vision slits as the creature selected test subjects. It would spray different compounds on different soldiers in the same squad, apparently comparing their effectiveness. Death became a data point in an ongoing experiment. The Tyrannofex doesn't resemble artillery. It resembles a biological hypothesis about what artillery would be if evolved rather than engineered. The creature stands 5 meters at the shoulder, broader than a Lehman Russ, with a carapace that absorbs last fire without visible damage. But the defining feature is the cannon. Where a termagant carries a weapon that is technically separate from its body, a symbiotic organism that fires living ammunition, the Tyrannofex integrates the weapon directly into its biological structure. The cannon grows from its dorsal spine, a tube of reinforced chitin with a bore diameter wide enough to fit a man's torso. The ammunition isn't loaded. It's grown in specialized organs and fed into the firing chamber through muscular contractions. Colonel Markin, commanding officer of the Grya 7 Artillery Corps, watched a Tyrannofex position itself 3 kilometers from the primary defense line. He'd trained for this. Counter-battery fire. His basilisks had range and accuracy advantages. He ordered all tubes to target the single organism. The Tyrannofex fired first, not at the artillery position, at the forward observation bunker that was providing targeting data. The projectile, later analysis identified it as a fused cluster of exploding beetles, struck with precision that matched digital targeting systems. The bunker vaporized. The Tyrannofex adjusted its aim and fired again, destroying the backup observation post before Markin's guns could triangulate its position. The artillery duel lasted 6 minutes. The basilisks fired 73 shells. 3 scored direct hits. The Tyrannofex's carapace cracked, but didn't penetrate. It returned fire with 22 projectiles, each one striking a different artillery piece with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible for a creature with no visible targeting sensors. Markin's battery was destroyed. The Tyrannofex remained in position, slowly regenerating its carapace while growing more ammunition for the next engagement. But the true horror of the Tyrannofex isn't its firepower. It's the way it chooses what to fire. Imperial forces on Prandium documented 8 different projectile types from a single Tyrannofex over 3 days of observation. Exploding beetles for soft targets, acid globes that melted through armor, spore mines that released toxins on impact, living organisms that burrowed into fortifications and exploded after a delay. The creature was adapting its ammunition to counter specific defenses. When Imperial forces deployed overhead protection against bombardment, the Tyrannofex switched to burrowing projectiles. When they reinforced against acid, it fired incendiary organisms. Each time the defenders evolved their tactics, the Tyrannofex adjusted its payload. Trooper Senna, one of the few survivors of the Artillery Corps, reported the most disturbing detail in her debriefing. She'd observed the Tyrannofex between firing sequences. The cannon's opening would dilate, and she could see movement inside the barrel. Something was being assembled. Multiple organisms working together, building the next projectile based on, she couldn't say what. Instructions from the Hive Mind, presumably. But it looked like construction, like manufacturing happening inside the weapon's body, each round custom-built for the target it would strike. The Imperium builds artillery that fires standardized shells. The Tyranids grow artillery that evolves ammunition in real time. Some Tyranid bioforms attack the body. The Maleceptor attacks the mind, and it does so in ways that bypass every defense the Imperium has developed against psychic assault. Grya 7's command staff included 2 sanctioned psychers, both tested and certified by the Scholastica Psychana. They wore psychic hoods calibrated to detect warp disturbances. When the Maleceptor arrived, neither psyker registered its presence. The creature moved through standard detection protocols as if they didn't exist. The Maleceptor is larger than a Malanthrope, but shares its unsettling presence. 4 thick legs support a bulbous cranium that pulses with visible electric discharge. The head, if it can be called that, is disproportionately large, accounting for 60% of the creature's mass. No visible eyes, no apparent sensory organs, just the massive skull and the constant lightning that arcs across its surface. Captain Vorn's command post housed 80 personnel. Officers, Vox operators, strategic analysts. They were coordinating defensive operations across a 16-kilometer front when the Maleceptor established line of sight from a ridgeline 300 meters distant. The sanctioned psyker, Lexus, reported later that she felt nothing. No warp presence, no psychic pressure. The Maleceptor wasn't attacking through the immaterium. It was projecting something else, a field that existed in real space but affected consciousness directly. The first symptom was confusion. Vox operators started relaying orders to the wrong units. Targeting data for one sector appeared on screens meant for another. Small errors, easily corrected, but they accumulated. Within 3 minutes, the entire command post was issuing contradictory orders. Officers were countermanding decisions they'd made 30 seconds earlier. Strategic maps displayed information that didn't match reality. Vorn realized what was happening when he looked at his tactical display and couldn't remember which units the icons represented. The information was there. He could see it, but the knowledge of what it meant was gone, erased from his mind while he tried to access it. He issued the evacuation order, but half his staff couldn't remember where the exits were located, in a building they'd worked in for 3 weeks. Lexus, protected by her psychic hood, remained functional long enough to identify the Maleceptor as the source. She reported that the creature wasn't broadcasting thoughts or images. It was disrupting the neural patterns that allow human brains to form connections between perception and understanding. Victims could see but not comprehend. They could hear orders but not remember their meaning. The Maleceptor turned intelligence itself into a liability. The effect faded after evacuation. Cognitive function returned slowly, like waking from deep sleep. But the implications remained. The Tyranids had developed a weapon against command structure itself, against the organizational intelligence that allows armies to function. Every officer, every strategic asset, every coordinated defense became vulnerable not to death, but to induced incompetence. Trooper Marlin, assigned to perimeter security during the incident, described watching officers stumble out of the command post, unable to remember their ranks, unable to recall the names of the soldiers they commanded. One colonel stood in the evacuation zone staring at his hands as if he'd never seen hands before, trying to remember what they were for. The Imperium trains against psychic attack. It sanctifies minds against demonic possession. It screens for warp taint and corruption. But the Maleceptor's assault bypassed every defense because it wasn't warp-based. It was biological, a naturally evolved predator that hunted consciousness the way a lictor hunts bodies. And it did so with precision that suggested the Hive Mind understood human neurology better than human psychers did. Grayeth 7 maintained air superiority for the first 3 weeks of the invasion. The Imperial Navy's Thunderbolt fighters operated from high-altitude bases the Tyranid ground forces couldn't reach. They provided reconnaissance, air support, and crucially, peace of mind. As long as the sky remained clear, evacuation was possible. The Hive Crones arrived on the morning of day 24, and they arrived in formations that suggested military training rather than evolutionary instinct. Wing Commander Tyra had flown missions against Orc Phytobombas and Chaos Hellblades. She'd logged 400 combat hours. When her Auspex registered the Crone swarm ascending from the digestion pools, she reviewed the threat profile with confidence. Bioflyers, large wingspan, probable acid spray capability. Her squadron had ammunition and altitude advantage. Standard intercept pattern. The Crones scattered before her squadron entered firing range, breaking formation with precision that matched trained pilots. They didn't flee. They repositioned, using thermal columns and wind patterns to gain altitude while minimizing energy expenditure. Tyra had seen Orc pilots attempt similar maneuvers. Most crashed. The Crones executed them perfectly. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. The Imperial squadron scored 9 confirmed kills. Tyra's own targeting systems logged a double kill streak, 2 Crones disabled by cannon fire. But the swarm adapted. After the first wave of kills, the Crones changed tactics. They stopped attempting to outmaneuver the Thunderbolts and instead began targeting their weapons. Not the aircraft, the weapons specifically. Tyra's wingman, Lieutenant Coves, reported a Crone making a direct ramming approach. He evaded, standard protocol. The Crone adjusted its trajectory at the last moment, slamming not into his fuselage, but into his underwing lascannon mounting. The impact destroyed the weapon and itself, but Coves's aircraft remained airborne. The Crone had sacrificed itself to reduce his firepower by half. The swarm repeated the tactic. Crones deliberately collided with weapon systems, trading their lives to disarm the Imperial aircraft 1 gun at a time. After 4 minutes, Tyra's squadron had lost 60% of its offensive capability. The Crones had lost 37 organisms. They still outnumbered the Imperials 5-1. Then the swarm stopped attacking. They maintained formation at distance, out of effective range, circling the Imperial squadron like predators, waiting for exhaustion. Tyra recognized the tactical problem immediately. Her squadron had fuel for another 30 minutes of combat flight. The Crones could remain airborne indefinitely. They were waiting for the Thunderbolts to return to base. The squadron landed with Crones circling overhead, watching, learning the location of the airbase, its defenses, its approach vectors. When the swarm finally attacked the base that night, they flew in low, below radar coverage, and struck the fuel depots first. The base survived, but the Imperium lost air superiority because the Crones fought like pilots, not animals. Tyra's after-action report noted something that military intelligence initially dismissed. The Crones, she wrote, didn't just learn from the engagement. They anticipated. When she'd attempted a maneuver she'd never used before, a high-G spiral break that wasn't in standard Imperial doctrine, the Crone pursuing her had already begun compensating before she completed the first rotation, as if it had predicted her action. The Hive Mind, she concluded, wasn't just observing human tactics. It was modeling human decision-making, simulating what a pilot would do, and preparing counters before those actions occurred. Fighting the Crones felt less like combat, and more like wrestling her own strategic instincts, mirrored back through alien neurology. Some bioforms aren't designed for war, they're designed for terror. The Dimachaeron falls into that category, though Imperial analysts debate whether terror is a side effect of its hunting strategy or its primary function. The creature stands 12 meters tall, when fully extended. 4 scything talons, each longer than a man is tall, curve from its torso like the arms of a mantis. The head is a triangular wedge of chitin with no visible sensory organs, yet it tracks targets with precision. But the defining feature is the speed. Sergeant Harkin's platoon held a reinforced position in Hive Primus. Stone walls 3 meters thick, reinforced with plasteel supports. Clear firing lanes covering 200 meters of open ground. A position that could withstand sustained assault from warrior-class organisms. The Dimachaeron crossed that open ground in under 4 seconds. Harkin's men had time to fire 3 volleys. Last bolts struck the creature's carapace and scattered without apparent effect. The Dimachaeron didn't slow, didn't alter course, didn't acknowledge that it was under fire. It hit the wall at full speed and passed through. Not over. Through. The scything talons tore gaps in the plasteel, and the creature's body followed with a sinuous movement that suggested joints in places bones shouldn't articulate. Inside the fortification, the Dimachaeron killed 17 soldiers in 11 seconds. Harkin, positioned in the command bunker, watched through a vision slit as the creature moved through his platoon. It wasn't attacking randomly. Each strike targeted a soldier who'd been firing, prioritizing those with special weapons. The Dimachaeron was clearing threats in order of capability, dismantling the platoon's offensive power before they could concentrate fire. But the kills weren't clean. The scything talons didn't just cut, they grabbed. Harkin watched a soldier lifted into the air, held for 3 seconds, then bisected. The body was discarded. The creature moved to the next target, repeated the process. Not feeding, not even killing efficiently. The Dimachaeron was taking time with each kill, ensuring they were witnessed, making certain the surviving soldiers understood their helplessness. When Harkin's platoon routed, standard protocol when a position becomes untenable, the Dimachaeron didn't pursue. It remained in the captured fortification, clearly visible, waiting, as if the position itself was irrelevant, as if the true objective was the psychological impact on any force that might attempt to retake it. The Dimachaeron's speed makes it nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Its path through a defensive position is too rapid for coordinated fire. By the time soldiers recognize the threat and aim, the creature has moved. Imperial doctrine recommends pre-sighted heavy weapons positioned at narrow choke points. But the Dimachaeron can scale walls, burrow through floors, and tear through barriers that would stop lighter bioforms. Trooper Venice, who survived an encounter with a Dimachaeron by playing dead under rubble, reported the aftermath. After the creature departed, she emerged to find the fortification intact, but empty. The Dimachaeron had killed every soldier it could reach, but it hadn't damaged the structure beyond entry points. The walls still stood. The defensive positions were still operational. The Imperium could theoretically retake the position, but Venice noted that no one wanted to. The surviving soldiers refused reassignment to fortifications the Dimachaeron had breached, not because the positions were strategically unsound, because the memory of how quickly the creature had dismantled trained soldiers in hardened defenses was too vivid. The Dimachaeron had turned defensive architecture into psychological weapons. Every breached fortification became a monument to human inadequacy. Artillery counter-battery work depends on trajectory analysis. When an enemy gun fires, Imperial sensors track the shell's arc and calculate the origin point. Counter-battery fire follows within seconds, destroying the enemy position before it can relocate. The Dactylis makes this impossible. The creature resembles a mobile gun platform, 4 thick legs supporting a torso bristling with biocannons. But unlike a Tyrannofex, which fires from a single integrated weapon, the Dactylis has multiple independent barrels, 3 to 5, depending on the specific organism. Each barrel can fire different projectiles at different angles simultaneously. Colonel Heron commanded the artillery assets at Hive Tertius. His gun servitors were calibrated for rapid response to enemy bombardment. When the Dactylis began shelling his positions, the counter-battery protocols activated as designed. His guns returned fire at the calculated origin point. The Dactylis wasn't there. It had fired from a different position than its trajectory suggested, using curved barrel throats and variations in projectile velocity to create false targeting data. Heron's counter-battery shells struck empty ground. The Dactylis fired again, this time from a position 600 meters from where Imperial sensors expected it. The creature was spoofing ballistic data, creating phantom firing positions that existed only in Imperial targeting computers. Heron recalibrated. He ordered visual confirmation before committing to counterfire. His forward observers spotted the Dactylis and radioed coordinates. The artillery barrage landed on target, scoring 3 direct hits. The Dactylis's carapace cracked. 2 of its biocannons went dark. It kept firing. The remaining cannons increased their rate of fire to compensate, maintaining the same total output despite reduced weapons. The Dactylis had redundancy built into its design. Disabling part of its arsenal only made it adjust its fire pattern. Heron's gunners eventually destroyed the Dactylis with sustained bombardment. But the engagement consumed 20 minutes and 3 times the ammunition originally allocated. During that time, the Dactylis had shelled Imperial positions without interruption. Its fire coordinated with ground assaults that exploited each gap in the defensive artillery coverage. The after-action analysis revealed the creature's sophistication. The Dactylis didn't just fire randomly. It calculated counter-battery response times and adjusted its rate of fire to stay 1 step ahead. It would shell a position, go silent, wait for Imperial guns to target its last known location, then resume fire from a new position while the counter-battery rounds were in flight. The creature was playing a timing game against human reaction speeds, and it was winning because it could calculate those speeds with precision. Trooper Melk, assigned to a forward observation post, reported watching a Dactylis through magnoculars during a lull in combat. The creature wasn't stationary. Its multiple gun barrels moved independently, sweeping arcs that suggested range finding. But Melk noted that the barrels never pointed at actual Imperial positions. They were targeting points around those positions, calculating angles for indirect fire that would clear obstacles and strike vulnerable areas. The Dactylis was solving geometry problems in real time, finding firing solutions for targets it couldn't directly observe, and it did so with accuracy that matched digital artillery computers. On the 47th day of the siege, something changed across the entire planetary theater. Every surviving Imperial position reported the same phenomenon simultaneously, a sound that bypassed ears and registered directly in consciousness. Not a Maleceptor's cognitive disruption, not psychic assault in the traditional sense. This was signal, communication. The Hive Mind speaking, not in words, but in emotional wavelengths that translated to fear. Sanctioned Psyker Lexis described it in her report as the feeling of being swallowed, stretched across 47 days until I could perceive the scale of what was consuming us. She estimated that 90% of the planet's original biomass had been processed into digestion pools. The ground beneath Imperial positions wasn't ground anymore. It was a membrane stretched over organic matter, kilometers deep, that shifted with breathing motion. The scream carried information, not threats, not demands, just awareness. The Hive Fleet announcing that it had consumed enough biomass to transition from invasion to consolidation. The remaining Imperial forces weren't defenders anymore. They were the last uncollected resources, waiting to be processed. Morale collapsed across multiple regiments simultaneously, not from defeat in combat, but from the realization that combat had been irrelevant. Every successful defense, every Tyranid organism killed, every tactical victory, they'd all been meaningless delays against an outcome that had been decided when the Hive Fleet first made orbit. Commander Tyra, still grounded after losing air superiority, watched her pilots refuse to board their aircraft. Not from cowardice, from mathematics. They'd calculated the fuel remaining, the number of Crones between them and orbit, and the probability of successful evacuation. The numbers didn't support survival. Flying would just mean dying tired. The psychic scream didn't break soldiers by showing them horrors. It broke them by showing them irrelevance, by making them understand that from the Hive Mind's perspective, they were nutrients, not threats. That every action they took, every defense they mounted, was being accounted for in a calculation about caloric efficiency. That consciousness itself, that ability to fear and hope and plan, was just a property of complex carbon chains that would soon be reduced to simpler molecules. Imperial Command authorized full planetary evacuation on day 52. Every transport capable of achieving orbit was redirected to Graia 7. The Navy would hold the orbital lanes long enough for essential personnel to escape. The rest would receive the Emperor's mercy via orbital bombardment once evacuation was complete. Sergeant Vex's regiment was not classified as essential personnel. He stood in the mustering field outside Hive Primus with 7,000 soldiers, watching transports descend and depart carrying officials, tech priests, administratum staff. Each transport held 300 passengers. The math was straightforward. At current evacuation rates, his regiment would be waiting when the bombardment began. The Tyranids attacked the evacuation zones with organisms the defenders had never seen before. Not heavy assault bioforms like Carnifexes. Not even the terror forms like Dimachaerons. These were small, quick creatures that resembled nothing so much as human children, scaled and clawed, but child-sized. They moved through defensive positions with agility that made targeting difficult. They didn't attack soldiers. They attacked the transports. Vec watched a swarm of the creatures climb a departing transport, their claws finding purchase on hull plating. They reached the engine intakes and threw themselves inside, jamming the turbines with their bodies. The transport lost altitude, crashed into the landing field, and detonated. 200 evacuees dead because the Tyranids had evolved kamikaze organisms specifically designed to disable aircraft. The Hive Fleet was preventing evacuation, not by destroying the Navy assets in orbit, but by making planetfall too costly. Each transport that descended risked becoming a loss. After 6 transports were downed, the Navy captain commanding the evacuation suspended operations pending reassessment. Vex's regiment received the announcement over Vox. Evacuation suspended. Maintain defensive positions. Await further orders. The soldiers looked at each other, making calculations. The Tyranids controlled 90% of the planet. The remaining Imperial positions would fall within days. Bombardment would follow. The only question was whether they'd die to Tyranid assault or Imperial fire. Commissar Brand walked the line, executing deserters. Not many. Most soldiers accepted the situation. They'd understood this possibility since basic training. The Imperium was vast. Individual lives were resources to be expended. Graia the Seven would be purged because allowing the Tyranids to finish digesting it was unacceptable. The biomass they'd already consumed couldn't be recovered, but denying them the rest was worth 7,000 soldiers. Vec found himself thinking about the Malanthrope he'd encountered weeks earlier, the way it had studied his position with detached curiosity. He wondered if the Hive Mind remembered him, if somewhere in the vast distributed consciousness consuming the planet, his specific face was catalogued as a data point. Probably not. Humans were nutrients, not individuals. But then he saw it, on the ridge overlooking the mustering field. The same Malanthrope, or one identical to it, drifting into view. It observed the evacuation zone with that same patient attention, measuring, recording, learning human desperation as thoroughly as it had learned human defensive doctrine. Vec aimed his laser gun, didn't fire. He understood now that the creature was outside his effective range. That shooting would only waste ammunition, that everything he did was being observed and incorporated into whatever grotesque knowledge base the Hive Mind was building. He lowered his weapon. The Malanthrope continued observing. Imperial forces evacuated 12,000 personnel from Graia 7 before orbital bombardment rendered the planet uninhabitable. 300,000 soldiers remained on the surface. The Navy's bombardment lasted 6 hours, melting the crust to a depth of 3 kilometers. Magma flows continued for 2 weeks after the bombardment ceased. No Tyranid organisms survived on the surface. Deep-range Auspex detected movement in the planet's mantle, suggesting some bioforms had burrowed beyond bombardment range. But the biomass they carried was insufficient for reconstruction. Graia 7 was classified as purged. But 3 months later, Hive Fleet Behemoth attacked Talassa Prime with bioforms that demonstrated specific adaptations to orbital bombardment. Organisms with heat-resistant carapaces, creatures that burrowed instinctively when orbital strikes began. Bioforms designed to survive magma temperatures for limited periods. Inquisitor Carr, assigned to xenobiological analysis of the Behemoth campaign, concluded that the Hive Fleet had learned from Graia 7, that the Tyranids who survived in the planet's mantle, even if they died shortly after, had transmitted their experiences to the greater Hive Mind before being destroyed. That every defensive measure, every weapon, every tactic humans deployed was being studied, countered, and evolved past. His report included a section that was immediately classified at the highest level. The Tyranid threat is not merely consumption. It is understanding. Every world we defend teaches the Hive Mind how to better attack the next world. Every victory we achieve is purchased by providing the enemy with detailed information about our capabilities. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a collective intelligence that learns from every encounter, that shares knowledge across light years instantaneously, that treats warfare as applied xenobiology. We catalog their bioforms and develop counter-tactics, but they catalog us with equal precision, and their response time is measured in evolutionary cycles that complete in weeks. We are teaching a predator how to hunt us more effectively, and we have no choice but to continue fighting, because the alternative is extinction. Trooper Jens Malavar, one of the evacuees from Prandium, eventually returned to active duty. He was reassigned to a penal legion tasked with garrisoning worlds in sectors deemed at risk for Tyranid incursion. In his personal logs, he recorded a recurring dream, standing in a digestion pool, watching his body dissolve into component molecules. But instead of death, he experiences a strange awareness. He can feel himself being sorted, analyzed, categorized. Every memory he carries, every piece of tactical knowledge, every fear and hope, all of it cataloged and filed into a vast library of human experience that the Hive Mind is building. In the dream, he understands that the Tyranids don't hate humanity. They're not angry or cruel or sadistic. They're curious. They're studying what it means to be human, and they're learning with such thoroughness that eventually they'll understand humanity better than humans do. He wakes up uncertain whether the dream is nightmare or prophecy, whether what terrifies him is the dissolution of his body or the preservation of his mind in a consciousness that will outlive the Imperium by millennia. The Tactica Imperium now contains threat profiles for 17 distinct Tyranid bioforms that weren't documented before Hive Fleet Behemoth. Each entry includes detailed anatomical diagrams, weapon ranges, behavioral patterns, recommended countermeasures. The information is comprehensive, precise, useful. It will be obsolete within a decade, because the Hive fleets that emerge from the intergalactic void carry new forms, adapted to counter the very defenses those profiles suggest. The Tyranids that attacked Ultramar demonstrated resistance to flame weapons previously lethal to their kind. The swarms that consumed Iondan arrived with bioforms specifically adapted to fight in zero-gravity environments, something previous Hive fleets hadn't needed. The Great Devourer is not a fixed threat. It's an ongoing conversation between humanity's ingenuity and alien evolution. Every defense humanity develops creates selection pressure that produces new adaptations. Every weapon deployed teaches the Hive Mind what to defend against next. The war is not about defeating an enemy, but about delaying an outcome. That becomes more inevitable with every lesson learned. Guardsmen training now includes psychological preparation for encountering bioforms outside documented classifications. Soldiers are taught to report accurately rather than fight incomprehensibly. Command staff have standing orders to catalog novel organisms before attempting engagement. The Imperium has accepted that the enemy's greatest weapon is not its teeth or claws or biological artillery, but its ability to become something new. That every defense humanity mounts is simultaneously an education the Hive Mind receives willingly. That consciousness itself, the ability to fear, to adapt, to remember, is a trait the Tyranids are learning to metabolize along with biomass, and that some of the creatures emerging from the digestion pools are beginning to demonstrate that understanding in ways that suggest they know what terror means, what hope costs, what it feels like to watch your world dissolve into alien biology, and understand that your death is not an end, but a transformation into something that will continue without you. The Tyranids. Humanity fights today are not the Tyranids. Humanity will fight tomorrow, but tomorrow's Tyranids will remember today's battles with perfect clarity, encoded into genetic structures that span galaxies. They will know what worked and what failed. They will arrive prepared for every weapon, every tactic, every desperate defense. And they will still be learning.